traveller parent has asked that their daughter doesn't attend lessons that include information on reproduction and relationships for cultural reasons. And the question is, how should we respond? And just to clarify, I think the question's sort of been worded in that way to avoid any words that might make anyone feel uncomfortable. So yeah.
Okay, so I'm actually going to just, because the rules around this changed relatively recently. So so just to start off by saying, so there's a difference looking at legally in the law between attendance in education around reproduction and attendance in education around relationships. So actually, anyone can say they don't want their child or young person to take part in education around reproduction. And just to simplify it, you'd often see that described online, or it's probably more usually called sex education. That would be the sort of term. And when you look it up online, that's sort of when a lot of the guidance uses that terminology. Relationship education, you're actually not allowed to withdraw your children from, which is quite an interesting thing that I hadn't really realized until I was asked all these questions. And then in 2019, the law changed slightly around education on reproduction to say that young people can have a choice to opt into sex education around reproduction from 3 terms before their 16th birthday. So that's just quite an interesting change to the law, that actually once you get to that age, it then becomes a choice that the young person can be free to make. I don't honestly know how many young people know that and would choose to take it up, but I think it's important to realize that even with education around reproduction, at a certain point, the view of the law is that becomes a choice for the young person, what 16-year-old wants to be called a child, to make, rather than you as parents, which I haven't got to the stage of having a 16-year-old child yet, but I can imagine that might be quite a difficult thing to sort of get your head around. So it's an important change to be aware of in the law.
Yeah.
In terms of how a school would deal with that, I think it would be, important for the school to talk to parents and explain that to them, because again, I think you're hitting that sort of cultural clash, sort of the difference between the sort of maybe the expectations of different people. It's very interesting and hard for parents, I think, because you're handed, when you have a baby, you get this tiny baby, you make all the decisions from it, and it can be very difficult, I think, to sort of, when other agencies take over. So I'm not, I think as a school to recognize that and recognize it will be hard for people to accept that the law and the state does come in and say some of this is not really up to them to do. And I think it's about sort of explaining, and I think explaining why, the importance of it. So, in the modern world, children, again, I mustn't keep going back to my own childhood, but we've got the internet, we've got, it was a big issue last week with the idea that the police forces came to the schools and said, actually, children are at risk of sort of exploitation because they might take pictures of themselves. And I know even at my children's primary school, we got an email about it. So there's sort of really wide issues that go to the safety of children, which schools now have to address, because they're probably the only agency that can, that perhaps maybe weren't so much of an issue for us at our age. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think it's just getting that wider context in as well, and for the school to try and explain why it has to do what it does, sort of drawing on safeguarding and things, which I know are really complicated ideas, because the schools didn't have that, or haven't always had that degree of responsibility, but it is increasingly being